When Steve Vai was 20 years old, he joined Frank Zappa's band. He was getting paid $1,000 a week. According to Vai, he has two simple rules to never have financial troubles. Always live below your means and always put aside 10% of any income that came in. Once he asked Frank for advice on how to become successful, and Frank said, "Always keep your publishing." At the time, Steve didn't know what publishing was, so Frank gave him a number to an attorney. And Steve went and bought an hour of that attorney's time and learned what publishing is. It saved him millions of dollars through the years of his career. Steve says, "Musicians and businessmen are different kind of people. Musicians have passion for music and businessmen have passion for numbers. And you need to be both because musicians usually get bad deals. They are intimidated about the business side. First and foremost, you have to have publishing company, which is very easy to start. You just fill out some papers." Steve did it in 1980. He just paid $12. He had to drive downtown to the legal building. He filled out some papers, and so he had a publishing company. And since then, his music has been protected. Everything he wrote, he owned. Publishing is the most important thing for a musician in the music business, Steve says. A song is like an idea. It's intellectual property. You have to own it in order to protect it. You start a publishing company and register your songs. Very simple. When Steve left Frank Zappa in 1983, he had only $14,000. He recorded his first solo record in his home studio. Here's what Steve Vai wrote on his official website. "This was my first real solo album. I saved up all the money I earned working for Frank, $14,000, and put a down payment on a house on Fellows Avenue in Sylmar, California." According to Scott Tunis, Frank Zappa paid his musician, including Steve Vai, $1,000 a week in 1981 and $1,100 a week in 1982. So during his stint with Frank, Steve was saving up his money. He was putting aside 10%, $100 every week, and after 3 years of work with Zappa, when he left the band, he had $14,000. So Vai recorded his first solo album in 1983. He called it Flexible. At first, he did it just for fun. He pressed up the music on a dozen flexi discs and gave them to friends. Flexi discs were the cheapest option a person has to market their project, and this is where the name of the album, Flexible, comes from. All Vai's friends loved the record, and then he decided to get a record deal. He went to a record label, and they offered him a deal. Then, as now, the standard record deal involves signing away all of your copyrights in return for upfront advance. Generally, it was around $10,000 back in those days, and a minuscule royalty of a few cents for each record sold. That's how much Randy and Jakey Lee got for their music on Ozzy's records. Jakey Lee said he got $5,000 to record Bark at the Moon, and then they gave him $10,000 to make up for not having writing and publishing. So Steve had to sign away all his copyrights. In return, he would receive $10,000 and 25 cents for each record sold. But he remembers Frank's words, "Always keep your publishing." And Steve took the contract to his attorney, and the attorney said, "No, that's a record deal, and that's how they work." And Steve said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sign it." So he looked at how the industry works. He found out that the record labels sell their records to distributors. Vai started looking up distributors. But distributors don't sign artists, they sign labels. So Steve formed his own label, Akashic Records. Then he met Cliff Cotteri, who headed up Important Records Distribution. Cotteri was a big fan of Frank Zappa's music. So Steve sent him his record, and Cliff said that he had to think. And then he finally said, "Okay, I'll take 1,000 records and I will pay you $4.10 each." And Steve thought, wow, that's awesome. He manufactured 1,000 records and sent them to him. Then he took another 1,000, another thousand, another thousand, and another thousand. Then all of a sudden, the Attitude song hit in Guitar Player. And then after Crossroads, Vai became known to a wider audience. People started recognizing him. And then when CDs came along, Important Records was acquired by Sony. Vai started getting $7.50 for each CD sold. And Vai says, to this day, Sony distributes Flexible, and they have to account to me $7.50 for every CD sold. I mean, that's more than they've paid any artist in history, I'm sure, because it's a distribution deal, not a record deal. Pretty cool. So, Steve Vai now sold about 400,000 copies of Flexible. He made millions of dollars from it. So, Frank's advice really helped Steve become wealthy and not worry about money. And Vai says, if you're not interested in the music business, then you can have a manager, but then don't be surprised that someone ripped you off. I've never allowed anybody to write or receive a check on my behalf. Never any manager, any publisher, nothing. Every check is written to Steve Vai or one of my entities, and it has to go to me. And then anybody that I owed a commission on, they have to invoice me. It's not like all my money goes to a manager and then I have to ask, how much money do I have or can I buy this, like Ian Gillan does, for example. He has managers. And Steve continues, this is just insane to me. I never did that. And it was a problem in some situations when I was in a band. Steve says it comes from Frank. He said, keep your publishing. And Steve has always been like a bulldog on that. However, when Steve was recording an album with Ozzy in 1994, Ozzy gave him his advice not to obsess about publishing and writer rights when working with others and exclusively focus on creating a good song. So, okay, here's what happened. Ozzy and I were supposed to write this stuff, Steve recalls. A musician came in who was working with us, and he started submitting ideas. And I was naive, and I said to Ozzy, what's the situation here? I was under the impression that you and I are writing this. And Ozzy, in his innocent brilliance, said, I don't give a crap if he comes down here and writes something. We just need a good song. And that was the end of my publishing demon, Steve says. And looks like that was the end of his collaboration with Ozzy as well. Although Steve wrote a bunch of songs for Ozzy's 1995 Osmosis, the only song which remained on the album was My Little Man. It's well known how the Osbournes work. They keep publishing for themselves. So eventually, Zakk Wylde was brought in and the album was rewritten. In the 1980s, Steve Vai also tried to be a businessman. He got into real estate. He liked architecture and homes. He started doing some research and he thought, I can buy a house for this much or buy a piece of land and build a house and make a tremendous amount of money. He had an agenda in it, and I spent a couple of $1 million building a home, and when it came time to sell it, the recession hit. So he lost a lot of money, but learned a great lesson. Business never worked, and music always works, Steve admits. In the 1980s, Vai played in top bands with rock legends. He replaced Yngwie Malmsteen and Alcatraz. And after Alcatraz, David Lee Roth called him and asked him to join his band. So he was the guy who played after Eddie Van Halen with David Lee Roth. He became famous. And then he was asked to join Whitesnake. In Whitesnake, Steve Vai was treated like a star. It is rumored that the record label paid him $1 million to join the band. So that was a great deal for Steve. Today, Steve Vai earns tons of money from streaming, social media, merchandise, album sales, publishing, and touring. He says nowadays it's so much easier than ever before to be independent and make money. The technology is there for you. And there's a multitude of ways to own, control, and collect fully on all your intellectual property. I love the music business. I really do. It's a great business. You hear all those stories, and sure, a lot of this is true, but you don't hear a lot of people talking about how great it is. There's so many opportunities.